I'm really happy to welcome Michael Knowles to the podcast. He's the well-known conservative political commentator. He's host of the Michael Knowles Show at the Daily Wire, and he has a big important book coming out, well, tomorrow. It's called Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. Michael, welcome to the program. Great to have you. Looks like you are taking on the biggest issue in the country today, namely this issue of censorship. But censorship, I take it, you're not just talking about digital censorship. I take it you're talking about the way in which thought and ideas and expression is suppressed across the culture, right? From schools to campuses to corporations where you can get the boot. This is a society-wide problem. Say a word about what is the scope that you cover in the book?
The issue of the censorship, not to bring everybody down here, it is much worse than anybody thinks it is. You know, a friend of mine says that the difference between a Scottish optimist and a Scottish pessimist is a Scottish pessimist says things can't get any worse, and a Scottish optimist says, oh, yes, they can. That's what I'm telling you in this book. It is actually much worse. We hear about critical race theory. We obviously know about big tech censorship. The 3 oligarchs in Silicon Valley suspended the duly elected sitting president of the United States. So obviously censorship is very bad, but it's much broader than that. The kind of censorship that's going on right now is in a way a kind of pre-censorship. The way in which the left has controlled our language, has controlled our symbols that we use, has controlled our ideas, is actually censoring us before we can even think of the ideas that we are attempting to articulate. And this is not a new phenomenon. You know, we think now about critical race theory is very much in the news, or cancel culture, or wokeness, or the gender theory, or whatever. But it goes back further, actually, to one of the great books of the last 30, 40 years, your own book, Illiberal Education, talking about what was going on the campuses in the 1980s, 1990s. It goes back even further than that, to the new left of the 1960s. It goes back further than that, actually, to the critical theorists who thrived in the 1930s, came back in the 60s. It goes back even further, I think, to a line from Karl Marx. He wrote it in a letter to Arnold Ruge, and he called for the, quote, ruthless criticism of all that exists. And I think this culture of critical race theory, debunking, deconstruction, it all comes out of that, and conservatives have been absolutely impotent at stopping it.
Let's look at some examples today of this phenomenon. And the phenomenon, I take it, is one of establishing categories and terms and maybe frameworks of thinking about debates so that you rig the outcome by the way you set up the problem.
Yes.
I mean, to me, a good example of this would be something like the concept of proportional representation. If a bunch of people apply for a job and you discover that the outcomes don't match the racial breakdown of society, we're supposed to believe that that is somehow intrinsically racist. Now, to me, that's flat out nonsense. I mean, if you look at Indian Americans in this country, we seem to be concentrated like in 6 fields, right? We got Indian doctors, you've got a bunch of Indians running motels, running across the country. You've got one Indian or a couple of Indian political figures like me. So what you're getting at is the Indians, you don't have a lot of Indians in America who go into, say, farming. And so just by introducing the notion of of proportional representation, you're making people think in a way that produces a prefabricated outcome. Is that kind of what you're getting at, or am I off track here?
Certainly, you're absolutely right. There's a story out of a Minneapolis or Minnesota school district, I forget exactly where in Minnesota, that is now calling for the end of suspensions of students because they saw that a disproportionate number of Black and Native American students were being suspended. So this is just evidence of systemic racism, and now we've got to let students run free doing whatever they like in the classroom. It doesn't seem to me particularly equitable or just, but that is the kind of perverse logic. But it's even, I think, more insidious than that. I go back often to the example of gay marriage. We now have this concept of same-sex marriage, marriage equality. And regardless of what you think about same-sex marriage, the redefinition of marriage, the more interesting aspect here to me is the way that the supposed debate took place, because there never was any debate. We know that the way that it became a law was through the Supreme Court, through the romantic poetry of Justice Anthony Kennedy. But even beyond that, the debate became over whether or not we should give gay people the right to get married. But that's actually not the question of same-sex marriage. The question was always, what is marriage? Does, as civilizations have thought from the dawn of time until about 5 minutes ago, does sexual difference have something to do with marriage? You know, husbands and wives? Or does sexual difference have nothing to do with marriage? It's merely the union of two people, not three or four for whatever reason, but two people who love each other and want to get along together. That was the debate. And the way that the left rigged the game was they assumed their own conclusion. They assumed that sexual difference had nothing to do with marriage. They begged the question, is the technical term. And so when it became a question of who has the right to get married, well, we all agree everyone has the right to get married. But that wasn't the issue to begin with. And I think even many conservatives have totally fallen for that trick. And so that they don't even know they've been played by the time the issue's over.
Yeah, it seems to me historically marriage has had a number of sort of definitional attributes, right? First of all, one man and one woman, yes, but also marriage is limited to two people. You can't have a marriage of 7 people who decide to go, we'll all marry each other. Obviously, you can't marry someone who's a close relative. Obviously, you have to be a certain age in order to be married. So it's very interesting to me that when gay marriage was introduced, it's sort of like they were saying, let's pull up this one peg of the marriage definition, but leave all the others intact. Because of course, the obvious question becomes if it's merely a matter of consenting adults, you should be able to marry your son. Because after all, if both of you agree, and let's say the son is now 19 years old or 22 years old, so he's an adult, he can contract for himself. Why can't you marry your own close relative? So I think you're right. But let me ask you this. While I agree with you that reflects a certain kind of, you may call it sly manipulation of terms, why would it fall under censorship or speechless? Because it seems to me you're not dealing with censorship there. It's almost like they're pulling a rhetorical trick on you, the way a lawyer might in a courtroom. They're fooling you, but they're not censoring you.
So the rhetorical trick here leads to a kind of censorship. And I think this is why conservatives have gotten this issue wrong. I'll take it even into the stranger sexual realm, because I think this highlights it a little bit better. The pronouns. We are in a national mania over the pronouns. Is Bruce Jenner, now Caitlyn Jenner, a he or a she? Now, the left will alternately tell you that it is very important that you call Bruce Jenner a she, and also, it's not a big deal. Just go along with it. Just come on, you bigots, go along with the she. Now, they know that in those little pronouns, there is a whole premise, a very essential premise about human nature. What is a man? What is a woman? So the left obviously cares quite a lot. They've invested a lot of time and resources and energy into this question. If Bruce Jenner is a she, if we all have to go along with this, that will utterly warp our perception. So in some cases, you will be deplatformed if you refer to a man who thinks he's a woman as a he. That's one example of censorship. In certain schools, you'll be punished. In certain aspects of the government, in corporate America, you'll be punished. There's a censorship that's involved there. But to my mind, the issue is not so much that we have a debate at the moment between free speech and censorship. I think the left is a little smarter about this. They realize that there are always going to be standards. There are always going to be some limits to speech, because if Bruce Jenner is a she, then he's not a he, and vice versa, because words necessarily limit the way that we view the world. And so I think what the left has done is they've disingenuously in the 1960s used this free speech campaign to destroy all the old standards, only then to reimpose their own new standards. And I think conservatives have totally lost the narrative here. And so, unfortunately, either way we react to this campaign seems to advance the left's agenda. Either we go along with the new standards, we call Bruce Jenner a she, and that advances it, or we eschew standards altogether. We say, you can say whatever you want. I'm an absolutist of free speech. You can have critical race theory in schools. You can teach radical gender ideology, whatever you want. I'm an absolutist on this issue. Well, the problem is, either way, the traditional standards are abandoned, and because nature abhors a vacuum, the radical new woke standards fill their place.
When we come back, I'm going to probe this a little bit further with Michael Knowles.